I think we can agree that, in essence, peacekeeping inherently is a political action. And it's a decision made at a political level. And if sometimes you have situations around the world where the UN Security Council waits a little too long and 500 or 800 million or 100,000 people die while they're making a political decision. And this was particularly emphasized in the political advisor's office just before I arrived, because there was an incident where S4 was searching, one of its objectives was to track down war criminals. And as part of that, they had heard that one of the most wanted was located in the Republika Srpska city of, or town of Palais. And there was a raid, and a priest and their son were injured, and that, despite whatever preparations, that was the news story and not the actual hunt for the war criminal. And as a result of that raid, again, the political advisor's office had to get involved. Now, although our office was out of Sarajevo at the S4 headquarters, we did have hairy moments. And it came down to language. I fluently speak, read, and write Ukrainian, so I basically understood about 1/3 to 40% what was being said at any particular meetings. And we were, I worked for a Turkish diplomat, who's the second from the left there, who had been in Bosnia 2.5 years before I arrived. And we'd go to meetings deputy minister level and above. And at one of these meetings, the Serbian deputy minister of defense turned to me and said to me in a perfect Eastern European way, he pointed at me and said, "I know you understand our tongue." And at that moment, we always had an interpreter because my boss, Mr. Aktash, never learned any Serbo-Croat. And so I turned to our interpreter and I sort of go, like, "Are you going to translate that?" And she just looked at me and went like, "Really? You want me to translate that? You fully understand what he just said." The hairy moment came a few weeks later because my Portuguese driver was driving our little vehicle downtown into Sarajevo. We stopped at a stoplight, and my window's down, and it's warm. And all of a sudden, you feel a car pulling up beside you. You don't really see it because you don't want to look. And you're looking straight, and you hear the window being rolled down. And at that moment, I reached for my 9mm, hoping I had loaded it. And all of a sudden, it's this deputy minister of defense leaning across his driver to go, "Kako ste, Marko? Kako ste?" Like, "How you doing, Mark?" And I go, "Dobro, dobro." Good thing I didn't pull my 9mm. But that was one of those sort of hairy moments where you feel the hairs on the back of your neck stand up a little bit. Okay, so this is just a quick outline of what I wanted to just cover today. In 1999, there was a paper written for the American military looking at the role of Polads in Europe. I sort of looked at it, and because that was just a few years before I ended up in Bosnia working for the NATO Polad. So they identified there were 6 areas of interest that a political advisor had to be involved in or understand. And as a result, they tended to be members of the diplomatic corps. Like Mr. Aktash was a Turkish diplomat who his posting before Bosnia was the consul general in Chicago for the Turkish government. The commander S4 had his own American political advisor, to advise on American aspects, never mind just the NATO aspects. The British deputy commander, brigadier, had a British political advisor, and the French operations officer, who was a colonel, also had a French political advisor. I won't touch into any activities that he was involved in. But they identified that a political advisor's got to be understanding of what's happening within the theater as well as what's in the region. So this is a symbol for the Bosnian parliament. Now, to be part of understanding what's in theater, you've got to understand what's happening in the economy. And again, this was an unfortunate feature, anybody who served in Bosnia, of just about every town, village, and city and rural areas across the country, is cemeteries. This is actually the entrance to Pale that I had just mentioned, and that's part of that regional understanding. How regional forces influenced political and military developments within SFOR. And what's the impact of RS, or Republika Srpska, the Serbian or Croatian actions on events in Bosnia-Herzegovina? Political advisors often also have to be understanding of national, foreign, international, and NGO interests. On the national foreign aspect, be aware of all nations' policies in order to alert the commander to differences that could complicate operations. And this was resulted in our attendance at NATO meetings. So like again, I mentioned that there were 3 other political advisors, and everybody brought something different to the table as compared to what the NATO political advisor was providing to the commander of SFOR. Internationally, you're needing to monitor activities of various organizations to determine the future of environment, including NGOs such as we've heard the organization Security Cooperation Europe, if I remember correctly. So you have to obtain advance notice of international initiatives to aid SFOR efforts to plan for their execution. For example, in October of 2004, there were municipal elections being held in Bosnia, organized by the OSCE. And I was the SFOR representative at those meetings. And again, the political advisors have to be of senior enough diplomatic status to be able to use contacts that they've made over time to obtain national positions formally or informally. So the NATO SFOR political advisor, what's their role? And we'll just briefly look on within theater and region. Again, he was an equivalent to a 2-star. And that came interesting because I reminded the British brigadier who was going to tell me to tell the Polad to do something that in fact the Polad outranked him. And he reminded me that of that particular point several times during the tour that I was with him. I think partly in jest, but not entirely. And again, as I mentioned, I may have mentioned the NATO political advisor reported directly to the Secretary General, and that was part of one of the duties I had in writing English language reports to the Secretary General. Again, this just a picture, an aerial photograph of Camp Boutmir, where SFOR was headquartered. The picture at the bottom is just an example of us going to the opera to see what's happening at the opera. And they had an orchestra going in Sarajevo, despite the fact that they were playing inside of a bombed-out building. This is a market street in Mostar. If you've looked at the map in the back, I've got a similar photograph with my boss, Mr. Aktash, actually on there as to where that street was. In Croatia, Malé Stone, small stone. This is an example of the battlements that are scattered all over the region. This was built, I don't know, in the 1600s to protect Croatians from Turkish invaders. And there was a village just at the foot of this, and this little this wall went literally up the hill, about 30 feet wide at the bottom, about 20 feet high. And basically, whenever the Turks would attack, everybody would gather their immediate possessions and their most precious possessions, their children and family, and go behind those walls. But again, being understanding of that sort of history as part of the equation. Again, you may have noticed this on the map at the back as well, this is a map from October of 2004, well into the situation in Bosnia, and the orange dots on there indicate the mines that still exist. So that was always a conscious thing. So this was up on the hill near the Olympic bobsled run. Right behind us is the bobsled run, which is, partially bombed out. On the other side of the road is an uncleared minefield. So the British Brigadier enjoyed Sunday morning walks in the woods and mountains around Sarajevo. And oftentimes we would gather for a brunch on Sunday morning to listen if there's a boom someplace in the distance. He had I think he was an SAS airborne light colonel who was his chief of staff, and he would just shake his head whenever we talked about these little walks in the forest. The other thing was in June of 2004, we went to Istanbul, Turkey, which was the site of a NATO summit meeting where they decided many things, including the transfer of authority from NATO to the European Union. The top picture is, if anybody's been to Istanbul, is the Blue Mosque, which wasn't all that exciting when you go inside, I found anyways. The bottom picture is a bomb disposal unit out dealing with a bomb that just happened to appear on one of the main thoroughfares going from down the river up into Taksim Square kind of thing. So it was interesting again that you get a real understanding about entrepreneurship, because not more than a minute after the crowd was stopped by the police from walking this distance, did a young fellow from one of the restaurants pull out a large blue tub of ice and bottled water and drinks to sell on the street. Now, mind you, it was also 30, 35 degrees outside. This is a visit from the NATO Secretary General. On the left, the two-star commander of S4, General Packet, and right behind them, over the left shoulder of the NATO SecGen, was the European SecGen equivalent. And this was their visit and this is again part of that foreign international understanding of what's going on. And this is counting the ballots during that the municipal elections I mentioned. Visiting all parts of Bosnia during the municipal election and so on were an important part of the NATO POLAD's mandate. And he actually enjoyed traveling all over the place, and I would go with him. And the first time I went out, I said, well, don't we need a road map and clearances and stuff? He says, Mark, Bosnia is mountains. There's one road in, there's one road out, so you're not going to get lost. But he enjoyed making sure we drove all over around the countryside, again, even during the municipal elections, just to gauge how many signs are going up, what kind of signs are going up, and how he can then interpret what is happening outside of Sarajevo to the S4 commander and making them aware, are there any concerns to be had? In July 2024, the first generals of the armed forces of Bosnia were selected and vetted to make sure there were no history of war crimes in their past, so it took some time. This then was a security cooperation course that NATO ran at the NATO school in Oberammergau with senior NATO officials, the Deputy Secretary General of NATO coming out, Director of OSCE Department for Security Cooperation, General DZ. I don't know if anybody heard of DZ. Yes, so a former British general who wanted to make sure he had all 10 fingers in every pie anywhere. as well as the chair of the Defense Reform Commission, Jim Locker. They all made presentations during that week, and this is just a photograph. At the front is, I think, the Deputy Secretary General in the middle with the generals on either side and some of the staff. This was actually a very effective, I thought, week, and certainly from the NATO Political Advisor's perspective, getting to know these generals and what he can estimate from his understanding of what they're all about and interpret that for the commander of S4. Now, as military assistant to the NATO Political Advisor, I was first and foremost a member of the Canadian contingent, arriving as a onesie in early June 2004. This is a photograph. By that time, the S4 Canadian element was down to basically just communications, and the fellow that was in charge was a lieutenant colonel while in that position, communications guy, and the lady in the middle was the Canadian ambassador to Bosnia, and this is just after the medal presentation. The red circle has me in it. Now, as part of it, like every Canadian soldier, I had to complete pre-deployment training, and obviously an important part is mines and mine awareness. I don't know if anybody who served in Bosnia had similar issue. It's not necessarily airplanes flying overhead that I remember at some of the ranges that I fired at here in Canada, but sheep crossing across the front of your range. That was a bigger issue in the hills around Sarajevo where we had our weapons training. And again, still part of the Canadian contingent, collecting donations from home for a shelter in Sarajevo. And this was a visit to that shelter, bringing a bunch of boxes of items that families need in Bosnia or in Sarajevo from Canada. So it looks like a jailhouse picture, but upon arrival, you get your S4 ID card. I had several because our offices were in the S4 headquarters, as well as, I don't know if everybody got a get out of jail free card, which I used to actually go to the international airport in Sarajevo, first time with a weapon, and they asked that I put it on the belt to x-ray it. As I walked through, my pistol came through and all the bullets are outlined. I don't know if anybody, it's probably the only time in my life I'll ever go through an international airport with a weapon. We also had regular mine awareness training that S4 organized, and critical to anybody, the laundry schedule and tags. And this was a tag that you would add to your laundry, and certain days, certain groups had laundry day, and that was picked up and the next day brought back. But this was critical, as you would discover. Again, part of my role was situational awareness. The S4, there was an S4 historian who was a naval captain writing the history of Decade, which became a book called Decade with Dayton. And he and I got along quite nicely, and he would often organize visits to different parts of Bosnia with his interpreter. And this was one of them. This is the tunnel that went underneath the airport. The tunnel obviously extended right underneath the airport from Sarajevo to outside of Sarajevo. They simply have kept the last 50 or 60 feet of it just to show people what it was like. So as you can see, I'm 6'3", so it was probably about 4.5 feet high kind of thing throughout. And in the bottom left is a photograph of hospital beds that were set on rails for evacuating casualties through this. And speaking to the historian's interpreter, apparently that was probably the most foul-smelling place in Bosnia that he had ever experienced, was that tunnel. Also, the legal advisor's office, whom I plugged into, also organized trips, and we went up to Srebrenica, and the pictures on the top are from Srebrenica. It was quite an incredible sight for the Muslim cemetery there of literally thousands and thousands of their markers. And this is, again, part of the street in Srebrenica. I don't have the exact corner where the Serbian general rubbed the head of a young fellow while his soldiers were killing their fathers and grandfathers, but I stood at that corner as well, and that was really quite frightening. Mostar, I have the map at the back as well as some photographs from Mostar. And again, this was a site that some senior officials from NATO often just came into Sarajevo, and then towards the end they sort of said, well, we'd like to see other parts of the country as well. So there was one organized trip down to Mostar. But this was a separate trip. And what was interesting is I had understood, or there was rumors that after the bridge was destroyed by the Croatians during the war, various groups from SFOR tried to retrieve those rocks or the stones from the bridge that had fallen into the river. Now, every time the Croatians saw this, they would open up a dam that was upstream from the Mostar Bridge, therefore raising the water so it became impossible for anybody to bring the stones out of the water. Now, rumor had it that a Canadian engineer came up with a scheme of, yes, we'll start doing that, and then we'll pack everything up during the day, and we'll leave as if we're going. And what he then ended up doing, they traveled down the road some ways, it turned dark, they came back while it was still dark, and by this time it was too late for the Croatians to react to open the dam's water, and they started removing the stones. Now, that's what I had heard. I'm still waiting to find someone who can definitively confirm that, but I thought that was sort of an interesting story. Now, many of the stones from that bridge, which was probably built about 500, 600 years ago, were recovered. However, a Turkish company was hired to rebuild the bridge, and for the stones that they could not bring up from the water, or retrieved from the water, they actually went to the original quarry and had them cut to fit the sizes that they needed. And in late July 04, they had a big opening ceremonies right where you see the front end loader. Prince Charles came out to that, and actually the NATO Polat and I were the first people across the bridge, because he called the Turkish company and said, hey, I'm a Turkish diplomat here, and I'd like to walk across the bridge, and we walked across the bridge before anybody else did. This is Dubrovnik, for anybody who's been there. We had some meetings, and again, down along the coast, there's a little bit of Bosnia that touches the water, and there were some meetings. I think it's a town called Neum, and after that meeting, the NATO Polat says, you know what, I haven't been down in this part of former Yugoslavia, so let's drive through it. So we spent some time in Dubrovnik, and I don't know if anybody's driven up the road to the east of Dubrovnik, but it's literally on about a 45-degree angle up, and there are no shoulders. And that was probably the most white-knuckle driving I ever made. And as part of that little trip, we were zipping along through the forest and mountain area, and I thought I'd noticed this big sign in Serbo-Croat that basically said, the road is out. But we were driving so quickly, I wasn't quite sure. Well, 2 miles up the road, or 2 kilometers up the road was out. They were rebuilding it. So I got out, and and the Polat drove the car as I looked for a pathway in and amongst the rocks. Unfortunately, we only had a Jetta. So if you could imagine a Jetta trying to get through, but we eventually got through. But that's how he quite wanted to visit the country, and we did. So again, as part of the role was getting to know people, as I think Jason touched on, and just about everybody in the room knows, is if you develop relationships with people, you can get much more done. And these are just some of the cards that I collected over time from the various offices of people I had met. Now, as you notice from above, it's the top picture is, again, I've met the commander of S4 oftentimes. The gentleman at the bottom left is an Italian general. And when I arrived in S4 headquarters, the defense reform, general in charge of defense reform was a Dutch fellow. And he had Dutch staff. And again, we clicked right off the bat. The only problem is he was leaving 2 weeks later. And he was replaced by this Italian general who had just finished some basic English language training. And it looks like we're buddies here, and we actually did become buddies because the first morning he was in Bosnia, he was walking to breakfast, and I was walking to breakfast, and I introduced myself, and all of a sudden I was his first non-Italian friend in S4, and we were buddies to the end, and when we both left, I think he gave me half a case of wine from his area of Italy or something, which the customs agents in Toronto didn't get too excited about. The last picture on the right is an event that we had organized that I'll be touching on, is ambassadors from various countries in Bosnia. Now, we got around, as I mentioned, oftentimes in Jeddah, but my favorite vehicle of moving around was the Black Hawk helicopter. And in fact, usually whenever the commander traveled, there were always 2 helicopters, and we were in the second one. And the crew was telling me that we were traveling so oftentimes with the commander, they almost stitched my surname in the seat I was always in. But what was very interesting, and again, I don't know if you've had this sort of experience, but the first time I was in the Black Hawk, we were flying about, and I was yawning and yawning and yawning. And the British aide-de-camp to the commander of S4 is looking at me, he's chuckling. And so I'm going, as we landed, I said, I don't know why I'm yawning. He says, well, have you ever traveled in a Black Hawk before? I said, no. He says, well, that's probably it. You're a little concerned about how you're going to fly, kind of a thing. And the other thing that I found a little distressing until I spoke to the crew was, that you have your pilots a full of array of all switches and stuff, so you can see all that. And then they had this little attachment. Definitely weren't Canadians, as we talked about Air Force having little things attached to them. And the number were in red, and the numbers would go up and go down and go up and go down, and I'm wondering, what the heck is that? And then I started paying attention through the area that we were flying, and the air crew confirmed that was the height above whatever's underneath us. So the smaller the number, the more concerned you should be. Okay, and one of the other tasks that our office, I took over, was drafting up communications for the incoming S4 commander, who was Brigadier Shook, and he eventually ended up being in Kosovo, in charge of, I think he got out and was a civilian rep in Kosovo later. Now, one of the things that we took on is, as you can appreciate, in the last dying days of NATO's involvement, a whole series of various events. And due to the sensitive nature of various events, as you can appreciate, they all had political implications for S4 and NATO. And as a result, we organized these high-profile events, assisted occasionally by the S4 Visitors Bureau. The first interesting one was the commander of Joint Force Command in Naples, Admiral Johnson, called us on a Monday night and said he'd like to have a party with 300 of his closest Bosnian friends on board a German frigate in Croatian waters, 3 hours drive away from Sarajevo. Well, by Friday night, that trip was organized, and the only issue that popped up was when the president of Bosnia asked the admiral, "Can I get back to Sarajevo earlier?" So instead of the admiral turning to his chief of staff talking to me and we making arrangements, all of a sudden I see the admiral and the president of the country heading off to the gangway to head back. And I'm going, hold on a second. In any event, that went without a hitch because we were some ways off of the coastline, so they had to get into individual boats, and I had escort officers for every group of people. We had helicopters, and because there was no airport or heliport near Newham, where the event, or just off the coast where it was, a local soccer team ended up with a new soccer stadium because we ended up using their soccer pitch as a heliport. The other visit on the left was, as I mentioned, the NATO Secretary General's visit to Sarajevo to announce the change of authority. And again, making sure ambassadors, up to that time, NATO, the Visitors Bureau had simply parked ambassadors by alphabetical order. And I said, no, they have to be seated by seniority in the country. So we made some changes. But that exercise was very good because we got escort officers for all the ambassadors, and it came out well because it was good practice for later events as well. Now, just briefly on the NATO to the European Union transfer, this was the invitation that went out to various people involved. This, we put it together with the S4 base Sergeant Major, who is an Irishman, part of the British Army, and the U.S. Political Advisor. I remember the three of us sitting down in the waiting area of the NATO Paul Ladd's office and coming up, putting together something that reflected American military traditions, Canadian military traditions, and British military traditions for a final ceremony. Now, this is the schedule of the night before, I believe. And there was a dinner party that the president of the country hosted, and it was raining, so being a good staff officer, I made sure we had enough umbrellas for all of our guests, including the Commander Sakur, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, who was a Marine. So his aide-de-camp came out after the dinner, and I said, will the general appreciate an umbrella? And he looks at me and goes, or no, he was shorter than I. Major Minenko, Marine generals do not use umbrellas. This then is the schedule of the events leading up to the ceremony, which is right at the bottom. So the NATO, the SACEUR was already in town, the NATO SecGen was in town, and then we're just waiting for the European Union Secretary General to arrive. And as you can sort of see, if anybody's been involved in these sorts of events, you're down to minutes. You know, they arrive at 11, they depart at 11:05. So if you got luggage to lug off the plane, you got 5 minutes to get that done. And right at the bottom there is basically the where the ceremonies are turned over at 11:25, I think. Now, for all the various military members at the S4 headquarters, each country contingent put on a special event, sort of like if you've been in Winnipeg, Folklorama. In other parts of the country, you have different cultural events being held, and people have passports going from place to place. Well, this was part of the passport that we put together so that, again, all the military members on the base felt that they were part of this transfer of authority and changeover. So here you can just see what people had at different places. So thank you very much. I hope this has just introduced you a little bit into the Office of Political Advisors, because I believe just about every mission around the world certainly coming out of NATO, usually has a political advisor as part of the senior staff. Thank you very much.